So intellectual property is strange because it's not very property. It's not proper property. The MPAA for a while had this thing that they put in the front of movies that said, you wouldn't steal your friend's car. You wouldn't grab people's money and purses. So why would you steal a movie? Well, part of the reason is that kind of property is slightly different than the other kind of property, the property that we're talking about. That kind of property is, well, for want of a better word, alienable. So when I steal someone's record collection, I have their record collection and they don't. But if I steal their MP3 collection, I have their MP3 collection and they still do. So it's a strange kind of thing, right? Now, where's the theft happening? Well, the theft is happening because I might have bought the same MP3s from that artist, but if I was going to buy them, I would have bought them. I wouldn't have stolen them. So is the artist really out anything? It's a very confusing kind of calculus to try to make this into property. But it's made into property for a very specific reason. The grounding, the legal grounding for intellectual property in the United States is actually written into the Constitution. And when I write a story, I feel like I have a moral ownership over it, right? Like I created that, it should belong to me. Or if I paint a painting, I created that painting, and just because I created it, it should be mine. But that moral authority to own something you've created that's intellectual is not part of the legal structure in the United States. It actually is in Europe for a bit. They have this idea of artists' rights or authors' rights. But in the United States, that's not the basis of the legal basis for intellectual property. It shows up in the Constitution, and it says very clearly what it does is it says that people will get a limited monopoly on their intellectual property. In other words, for a short period of time, they're the only ones that can sell it. But after that, anyone can. And the reason for that limited monopoly is because they want to encourage the production of creative goods, of inventions, of new cultural goods. So that's the reason we have intellectual property. It's not because there's some moral right to the stuff you create, although there may be, but that's not kind of present in our legal structure. It's because they wanted to encourage people to create stuff, and they thought one way to do that is to allow them to profit from it for a short period of time before anyone else got a chance to. All right. So why are we interested in intellectual property? Well, because the virtual world, the internet, is, of course, you can buy things there. You can go on Amazon and have whatever you want delivered, or eBay, and have whatever you want delivered to your door, right? But it's largely a realm of intellectual properties. It's built out of people's labor that has an intellectual component. When you make a website, it's not physical. It's out there virtually, and you still want to be able to have some kind of at least temporary control over how it's being used. So that's why intellectual property is especially important during kind of an internet age, because it gets used much more online than it would be in other contexts. One of the first big tests of intellectual property was Napster. And it strikes me as strange, but many of you are young enough that you probably don't even remember Napster. It seems like it was yesterday to me, but that's because I'm old. So Napster was a file sharing network. That means that it was a peer-to-peer file sharing network, which means that each of the files got little pieces of them put on everybody's computer, and then those got kind of transferred to a target computer. Well, this works really well for the internet because of the way that it's networked. Peer-to-peer systems work much more quickly than other systems might. And as a system, that's great. Nobody had a problem with peer-to-peer kind of in concept. The problem was that it was used almost exclusively to share music. And so there was a big legal case around the question of whether people could share music on Napster, and they couldn't. And there was the RIAA, the Recording Association, went after people who downloaded music illegally. So there was this big push for this, and it was one of the big battles that defined intellectual property online for a long time. Let's do a quick tangent here to talk about what kinds of intellectual property we have in the United States. In the US, there are a bunch of different kinds of intellectual property, but we'll focus on three of them. Copyright. Well, we'll start with patent, trademark, and then we'll deal with copyright, which is the one we're going to mostly be talking about. So patent is the protection of new inventions. So if I make a better light bulb, I can patent that and I can be the only one that sells it for a certain amount of time. For a long time, they had to be actual physical. Like you could actually go to the patent office and say, "Here's a working telephone. Now give me the patent." Now they let you patent what are things that are processed, and so these include things like algorithms. That's where the question of patent intersects with the internet, because a lot of ideas people have for how to do things on the internet do get patented these days. So, for example, if I want to, there's a patent out there for a reverse auction. If you've gone and bought tickets on Priceline, then you've engaged in a reverse auction where you say what you're willing to pay, and then the sellers kind of try to match that. And so Priceline owns that idea, and you can't create your own reverse auction for anything without paying Priceline for that honor. Amazon owns one-click. Well, Amazon owns the idea of our affiliate marketing, where if you follow my link, you buy a book, I get a couple of pennies. Nobody else can do that without Amazon's permission. Amazon also owns the one-click purchase. So if you go to Amazon, you can say buy it now and click on that. Nobody else can have a buy it now button. Everyone else has to have multiple steps. That seems like a really stupid idea. If you think so, I think so too. We all think so. Why is that a patent? The idea that when you click a button, you buy something. That doesn't seem like it. But they managed to get the process patent for it, and they managed to go after Barnes & Noble, and they sued them in November of, just before the Christmas season. And the judge said, you have to, until the case is over, you have to shut down. You can't do that. You can't sell online with one button. So Barnes & Noble couldn't quickly change their entire site, so they ended up basically dying that year. It was the use of the patent basically to kill off your competition, which was kind of nasty. And that's a lot of how process patents and algorithm patents are used. That is to kind of as a battering ram against your opponents. So that's patents. Then pretty much the process patents are the only place that intersects, but we're not going to talk any more about that. There's trademarks. Trademarks are a way of differentiating your product from other products in the marketplace. So only Jeep can sell a Jeep because they own the trademark for that. If Ferrari decides they want a Ferrari Jeep, they can't sell it as a Jeep, because you want to know that when you purchase something under that name, you're actually getting it from the producer who created it. So it's generally logos, but also names of things can be trademarked, and other stuff can too, like the Owens Corning insulation that's pink, the Pink Panther insulation. Nobody else can make insulation in that color pink. They've trademarked that pink for selling insulation. So it's a way of distinguishing your product from other products in the marketplace. Why does that intersect with the internet? Well, there's one particular piece here that's important, and that is when people use their trademark names as their web addresses, something.com. Early on in the web, somebody actually went out and said, hey, look, you can register anything. At the time, it was free to register a domain name. You can register anything. I just registered mcdonalds.com. And McDonald's wasn't happy about that, strangely enough. And for a while, people were doing that. They were registering companies' names and then squatting on them in order to try to sell it to them. Now there is a structure where if you own a trademark, you can actually grab that trademarked name from someone who's sitting on it. So the landmark cases on this were Madonna, the singer Madonna, and Sting, the singer Sting. Both went after Madonna.com and then respectively Sting.com. And the rule became that if you had a globally recognized trademark, you could actually pull back the .com. And somebody, I believe it was actually a porn site, had Madonna.com, and they had to give it up to Madonna because Madonna had trademarked her name. Of course, there's lots of people named Madonna, including a fairly famous person, but leaving that aside, Madonna had trademarked her own name as a singer, and so they had to give up Madonna.com to Madonna. Sting had sued this guy who tried to take over Sting.com, and Sting.com belonged to this, I think he was 12 years old, and he was a bee fancier. He had all this information about his bees on it, and he'd created this little website called Sting.com. And the courts decided that Sting didn't actually have a globally recognized trademark. He had a trademark in the United States, he had a trademark in the UK, but it was not globally recognized, and therefore he could not steal Sting.com from the guy who owned it. He could buy it, but he couldn't steal it from him. Or take it from him, I should say. It wouldn't be stealing, I guess. So that's mostly where trademark intersects with the internet, is in the question of who controls domain names. And we're not going to talk any more about that even though there's really interesting stuff around Amazon and around Victor's Little Secret and a whole bunch of other interesting cases. We'll just leave that aside. The big one we're going to talk about is copyright. And what does copyright protect? Copyright protects any creative work that you produce and then embody, either kind of in text or in a book or in a file or on a CD. Once you do that, it's protected as your property if you've created it. What do you have to do to get a copyright? Nothing. At the end of this video, I'll hit save and I will have a copyrighted video. All it takes now, after 1976, to copyright something is to produce it. The author is assumed to own something as soon as they've produced something. So you can register a copyright. That's a whole other thing. It makes it easier to sue, basically. But when you produce something, you have a copyright on it. And copyrights protect all of this stuff. Mostly we're talking about written work, video recordings, audio recordings, artwork, music. There's some odd ones in there like hull shapes, but leaving that aside, mostly it's that kind of thing, intellectual work, and you can protect it and you own it for your life in 80 years now. They keep extending the length of copyright, even though it was supposed to be a temporary monopoly. Every time once the copyright expires, whatever it is falls into the public domain, and Mickey Mouse keeps coming close to falling into the public domain, and every time it does, they extend Disney lobbies and they extend the Copyright Act to make it longer. Happy Birthday, I think, actually has now officially fallen into the public domain. For the longest time, this is why restaurants sing stupid non-Happy Birthday songs, because if they sang the Happy Birthday song, they would have to pay royalties for that song. It is an owned song. So, yeah. So there's copyright. Copyright intersects the internet in all kinds of ways. One of the kind of key landmark places here was for Napster. But it intersects in other places too. One of the questions is, how do you borrow stuff on the internet if it's copyrighted? How can I use an image? In this video, I will use images from elsewhere on the web, and I will be violating their copyright. Now, I have a defense, and there is a structure for defending against a copyright violation called fair use. So under certain circumstances, I'm allowed to. The courts have said I can exercise a right to violate someone's copyright. It's a defense. They can still sue me, but I can go to court and defend myself on this basis. And fair use says, there are certain reasons, going back again to the Constitution, which is saying copyright and these other protections are supposed to encourage creative work, or are supposed to make us more creative in what we do for the society. So they said, there are reasons you might want to go around copyright to actually encourage that original intent. And those fair uses are things where you kind of quote, when you write a paper and you quote someone in the paper, which you're supposed to do, that is a fair use of their material. You're reproducing something they've written and that is copyrighted, but you're doing it in a way that is considered fair use. So how do you decide whether some use is fair use or not? The courts have used it's not actually a 4-part test, but 4 elements to weigh whether they think something is fair use. The first is, what's the one that probably best. How much of the stuff are you taking? So if you take a sentence out of an entire book, nobody's worried that you're stealing their intellectual property. You're just making fair use of it without really impacting them at all. So if you take the smaller amount of the total that you take, the better. If I decided to say, oh, well, I'm making fair use of a full the most recent Harry Potter book, and I'm going to include that in my book, nobody's going to buy that. The totality of it, as kind of the entirety of it as a fair use, is a lot harder to defend. So the amount. There's lots of rules of thumb that are all wrong. Like, you can only use the first 4 bars of a song, or the first 40 seconds, or 1 chapter out of a book. All of those are rules of thumb that have no basis in law. Basically, they just look at what proportion of the total you've taken, and that's what they use to try to decide whether you're making fair use. The second of these is the nature of the use. So as I said, I've used lots of images in this video and other videos for the course. I've assigned things to you that I've kind of linked to, or that I provided to you. Part of the reason is that I'm using this in an education setting, and when you're using it for education, they give you a little bit more leeway. They realize that education needs to borrow materials from places, and so they provide some opportunity for you to do that. And so, if I'm using it for an education purpose, if I'm using it to inform the public, if I'm using it for science or research, these are all uses of the, or if I'm using it to criticize the work. So if I wanted to include a picture of, a Robert Mapplethorpe photo and then talk about why it was a good photo or a bad photo, I could do that because I was doing critique of that work. So there's the way you're using the work matters. The nature of the work itself is the third one. That is, what is this stuff? Is it Harry Potter would be easier to borrow, harder to borrow from than the local newspaper, because one is much more creative. So the more creative it is, the more original it is, the less it's based in fact, the harder it is to borrow from. So I can basically borrow pick up the front page of the New York Times, look at the top stories, and write my own version of those stories. And since I'm only taking the facts, it's not really a copyright violation. I can go to a map and reproduce some of that map in my own picture because I'm using it on a factual basis. So more fact, the phone book, the more fact-based it is, the more easy it is to borrow under fair use. When it's something creative like a poem, for example, if I use the whole poem and I'm not doing it for critique, it's going to be really hard to bring that in because it's something original to the author and it's very creative. And there's no good reason necessarily, again, unless I'm critiquing it, to bring it in and copy it. So the nature of the work itself is important. And the fourth is, and probably the most important is, how does my work negatively impact the ability of the original author to sell their work? So this was one of the ones that came up in Napster, actually, because what they did is they looked and saw where most people were using Napster, and it was mostly around college campuses. And then they looked and saw how record sales were around college campuses. And, Napster came along and suddenly people around college campuses were downloading tons and tons of stuff. And at the same time, they looked and they saw that album sales went up. They didn't go down. It didn't replace it. People actually went out and bought albums. So, went to a store and bought a CD. So it turned out that it wasn't actually negatively impacting them. Now, they could have tried to defend Napster on that basis by saying that rather than contributing to copyright, they were actually contributing to the sales of the record companies. They didn't take that as their tactic, but they could have to claim that it was fair use. So this is nice, but copyright and fair use, this gets very messy for the internet because so much copying is going on that traditional copyright code, and even with the addition of fair use, really didn't cover it. For example, if I go to a website, my browser actually downloads a copy of the image and the text and puts it in a cache on my computer automatically. Is that a copyright violation? Certainly, but under original copyright code, it is. I'm making a copy of the material and putting it on my computer. That is a copyright violation. But if you really enforced it as a copyright violation, that would kill the internet. You could not, or kill the web at least. You could not make the web work with copyright the way it was. So they needed to do some significant tweaks. And they did so in something called the DCMA, the DMCA, Digital Millennium Copyright Act. The DMCA was a giant section on a much more giant bill, the Telecommunications Act of 1996. And it did a whole bunch of stuff with copyright to try to make it, to try to solve a couple of problems. One, to make it be able to have the internet work and have the web work. So it did things like said you're allowed to make a temporary copy of a website in the process of delivering it on the browser. So it allowed that. But it also tried to make the internet safe for, WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, at one point was saying, we want to make the internet safe for Madonna. I think that was the quote that came out of it. In other words, they wanted to make it safe for copyright owners as well. And so they passed a whole bunch of stuff that made it more likely or more possible that they could protect their copyrights online. And I'm going to focus, even though there's a whole bunch of stuff in the DMCA, I'm going to focus on two things. One is the what's usually called the anti-circumvention code, and then the other is the safe harbor provision. And we'll touch on those two to start with. So the anti-circumvention code was designed to stop people from basically breaking through copy protection. So I'm not going to assume that anyone that's watching this has any illegal software on their computer. But if you did, then you probably know that that there are like little programs out there that will produce a key for you, a crack, a code that will allow you to run the software on your computer. And there's other ways you can get around copy protection. What the DMCA did was said this is illegal. In fact, this is, if you remember Napster, let's think about when there were still video rental places. So, some people would go and rent a videotape and get their 2 VCRs and sort of wire them together so that you could record a local copy, get a blank tape, go in and do home recording and record a copy of your of the movie that you just rented, so that you had it forever, so you could return it and still have the movie. It wouldn't be as high quality because this is all analog, but you could at least have a copy that way. Well, they started putting something on especially kind of commercial videotapes called Macrovision. And if you tried to do that with a tape protected by Macrovision, you'd stick it in, you'd record it, and it would kind of go, the resulting tape would kind of go whoomp, whoomp, whoomp. It would have like this fuzzy black thing that came through all over. It just made it unwatchable. That was the intent. So, but that was a problem. But for like $25.99 or something like that, in the back of a magazine, you could order something that basically circumvented Macrovision. That is, it made it possible you put this little box between when you connected, you connected this VCR to the box and this VCR to the box and made it go through there. And that removed the Macrovision protection. That was legal. People didn't like that, but it was legal. You could go and buy that and you could possess it and you weren't in any trouble. DMCA made even that illegal. Anything you did, no matter how trivial, to get rid of copy protection or to get around protection of some sort, was illegal. And it wasn't just illegal. You could go to jail for it. You could spend 5 years in prison for violating someone's the protection they had on their software or on their video or whatever. So this was a fairly big cudgel hammer you could hit people with if they violated copyright. And so this allowed also folks like MPAA, once movies started to get transferred over the net, to really go after people and find them and settle with them out of court, because nobody wanted to go to court and end up spending $50,000 for every video they'd downloaded or something like that. Now, this brings us to John Lech Johansson, who was this, I think, 14-year-old at the time over in Europe. DVD John was a Linux enthusiast. Linux is an operating system like Windows. For the other operating systems, Microsoft had paid so that they could play DVDs through your computer, and Apple had paid so that they could, paid a licensing fee so they could play these DVDs through their computer. Chances are at some point, maybe not recently, but you dropped a DVD or a Blu-ray into your computer and you played it through that screen. The reason you could do that is that it had a decrypting software on it called CSS. CSS took the copy protection on the DVD and allowed you to play it, but didn't allow you to then make a copy of it. So it was like a program that allowed you to see it without copying it on your computer. Well, John wanted to watch DVDs on his computer, but he was running Linux, and you couldn't buy the licensing software. He didn't necessarily want to steal anything. He just wanted to watch the DVD on his Linux machine. And so there was this decoding software that theoretically nobody could actually break, but he broke pretty quickly. And he created this piece of software called DCSS, which people could run they could watch videos on their Linux machines. And of course he uploaded it, because that's what you do with Linux, and shared it with everyone. And then the police came knocking down his door and seized all his computers and left the house with them and arrested him because he'd violated the DMCA. It was pretty weird because he'd put this code out there. Everyone had it, but it was like this secret code. It was like Voldemort or something. You weren't allowed to actually talk about it. And if you say sent this code, and it had been shortened into basically 4 lines of Perl, there was the DCSS code. And if you sent this to someone over the email, you could spend time in jail. If you printed it on a t-shirt, that t-shirt was now illegal. If you, in fact, the courts decided that even if you linked to a site that had it, because the New York Times and the Washington Post all linked to a site of a magazine called 2600 that had posted the code, not only was 2600 in violation of the DMCA, but anyone who linked to 2600 was now in violation of the DMCA and could go to jail for it. It's pretty crazy stuff. In fact, as a footnote in my dissertation, which was around this time, I put in a footnote that had the full code of DCSS to give you an example of what DCSS looks like. That means that my dissertation is, I've committed a federal crime by creating my dissertation. So it's kind of crazy. And it's kind of obviously crazy. But it's not the only case where this anti-circumvention stuff has gotten in the way. In 2001, a guy named Dmitry Sklyarov was working for a company in Russia, and they had produced something that decrypted PDFs long enough to make them readable for people who were blind. So basically what this was a screen reader for PDFs. But in the process, they'd had to break the copy protection that was on PDFs so that they could make a blind screen reader for them. But he was in Russia, and Russia was one of a number of countries that had not signed on to a version of the DMCA. Lots of countries had, most countries had, but Russia was at least not enforcing it in the same way if it was on the books. But this guy, the programmer, Dmitry, he was 27 years old, came out to Las Vegas to give a talk about his at a conference about his project, and the FBI came and arrested him and put him in jail. So basically, Adobe had kind of blown the whistle on him, saying he'd broken their copy protection. This was a violation of the DMCA. He had a newborn son back in Russia, but he spent 6 months stuck in the U.S. trying to defend this. Eventually, Adobe was the one pleading with the federal government not to keep prosecuting this because, it looked really, really bad, right? Here was this, I don't know that he's a kid at 27, but this young father who was a programmer who was trying to help blind people, and he'd been arrested because he'd done that. And this ended up becoming another one of those rallying cries. The anti-circumvention clauses in the DMCA are still in full effect. And they're problematic, but people run afoul of them pretty much every day, but they're still there. So this is one side of the DMCA. The second side of the DMCA is what's called the safe harbor provision. And so if I go to YouTube and I upload a copy of The Jerk, a film from the 1980s, or actually if I upload a copy, which I have done, of a trailer for The Jerk. For a while when I was teaching video editing, you wouldn't know that from these videos that I taught that, but I was teaching video editing, and I'd have the students in that class put together new trailers by taking a movie and taking the good cuts and putting them to music and doing a voice overlay and the rest of it. And one of them had done one that was for The Jerk, and I uploaded that as an example to YouTube. And of course they came down and they said, nope, this is a copyright violation. Now, because it's a copyright violation under traditional copyright law, they could just sue me because I just published it. Moreover, they could sue YouTube, because YouTube was the actual publisher of this video. And the problem with that is that nobody can ever be a YouTube if anytime anyone uploads something, they are sharing in the liability for that. So the DMCA carved out a space called a safe harbor provision, which said that if somebody uploaded something to your site, and as long as you allowed the copyright owner to alert you of it and you took it down right away, this is a DMCA takedown, as long as you had an email where someone could, or a telephone number where a copyright owner could contact you immediately and take it down within 24 hours, then you were protected as YouTube. Now, if I'm the person who uploaded it, I can then say, wait, no, I don't think it should have been taken down, and YouTube can put it back up. But in that case, YouTube is entirely protected. The copyright owner can sue me as the person who uploaded it, but YouTube has protected itself by creating a safe harbor. And so lots of things do this. Blackboard has a safe harbor provision. Facebook does. Reddit does. All of these guys have safe harbor provisions which allow copyright owners to claim a copyright violation and then gives the host a chance to take it down. You would think with all these protections you would be good, right? This is actually, the balance has tipped very heavily towards copyright owners. Not only have the copyrights been extended significantly, but the power they have to enforce that, to actually throw people in jail for violating that is pretty extraordinary. However, they still lobbied for more protection. And one version of this is SOPA and PIPA, these acts that are designed to be, theoretically, that are designed to, the claim is that they're designed to stop people from pirating, not pirating, but producing like fake purses and stuff, right? That was originally how it was pitched. But it became very clear that the design for this was to be able to go in and stop sites, to basically turn the whole internet into a takedown area, so that you could say, if anybody claimed that anyone was violating their trademark, they could get the website taken down immediately. And this was to stop mostly piracy, and often, especially to stop things like file trading sites and things like that. That was the intention. But it really would have killed every major site on the web. Social media would be dead because anyone could threaten to take down their site, and they would have to take it down. All they had to say is, "Don't like what you're doing, take down your whole site." And without any court process, without anything like that, they would disappear. The whole internet fought out against this. Not the whole internet, but large portions of the internet argued against this, including some biggies like Google and Reddit and a number of other large sites of the top kind of 10 trafficked sites. A whole bunch of them went black. They changed their backgrounds to black and made this protest. It's actually one of the interesting part of this is it's one of the very few examples of really good lobbying by using the internet to kind of shape code. Like the number, they did a roll call before the blackout, the internet blackout, and it would have passed easily. And then they did one after, and it was the vast majority of congressmen said no. And so, it was this huge shift in 24 hours, all because of this very large, very widespread effort to try to let people know what SOPA and PIPA were. Now, the trick is, of course, that various pieces of that have still made it into legislation here and there, because if you have lobbyists working towards this, it's really hard to stop it. It's come up in various names, and people have gone up against it again and again, but it's going to go through, and it has gone through. So it's one of those things like net neutrality, where there's just so much money behind it that it's really difficult for grassroots and for kind of civil rights people to try to fight up against it. So there's that. So what does all this mean? It means that the grounds for fighting about copyright are really the fodder of what makes the internet work. There's all kinds of pieces around peer production and borrowed material and all of this that really have to rely on taking other people's stuff and using it. So when copyright interferes with that, it gets really tricky. There are folks who've tried to kind of walk the middle line. There's a process called Creative Commons that at least makes it easier for people to make clear when they're not copywriting something, but just saying they want certain protections on it. So for example, I put a lot of stuff up saying anyone can use this as long as they cite me. This is called a Creative Commons license, and I can say it's CC, and you can do lots of things. You can say CC, but tell people who, you're allowed to use this, but tell people that it's me. You're allowed to use this, but not for commercial uses. You can use this as long as whatever you produce with it, you also make available for everyone else to use. So there's lots of kind of conditions I can very automatically put on stuff I put out there. And so that was one effort to say, okay, at least we can temper the Copyright Acts a little bit and give people the chance to share if they want to share. And so that has been marginally effective, I think, to allow people to share their work. And there's other things along that run, but understanding kind of how copyright works and kind of making it workable for the 21st century ends up being a big part of the question of control online. And especially in Europe, the Pirate Party is a party that started in Sweden and now has a seat in the European Union. And so they have taken this very small issue of pirates should have some rights and have parlayed it into a small social movement, which has broader implications. And so I think that if you really wanted to understand the kind of trade of power online, one of the good places to look for it would be in these discussions and arguments around copyright.